Hello, Lake County, Florida, and welcome to Around the House, sponsored by Romac Lumber and Supply. I'm your host, Don Magruder, and you're listening to my 790 AM in beautiful Leesburg, Florida. I'd also like to welcome our viewers on LSTV, Lake Sumter Television, for this very special on-the-air show. This is going to be fun today. Romac Lumber is a leading provider of building materials in Leesburg, and since 1946, local residents have been visiting our store located at 700 East Main Street in Leesburg for all of their construction needs. Now, probably one of the scariest and most controversial issues in real estate is the subject of eminent domain, the government's ability to seize your private property for the common good of all. In Lake County and Sumter counties, due to new and upgraded infrastructures, there are a lot of property owners who are getting these letters on eminent domain. Most property owners are not aware of the rights, and today we'll be discussing this very important and timely issue. We are very fortunate to have in our studio one of the top eminent domain attorneys in the state of Florida. Raymer F. Maguire of the Maguire Lassman Law Firm is an expert when it comes to eminent domain, and he has a proven background in eminent domain. And as this area grows, eminent domain cases will become more frequent. We also have in the studio Steve Jones. He's one of the top experts in eminent domain pipeline issues in the country. We're very fortunate to have him because, as you're going to find as the show evolves, there's a major issue evolving in Lake and Sumter and Marion counties in eminent domains in regards to pipeline. Do need to make a disclaimer. Today's show is for discussion purposes only and not intended to offer any particular legal opinion or advice. Always consult your attorney before taking any action. So with that, I'd like to introduce Raymer F. Maguire and Steve Jones. How are y'all doing today?
Doing fine. Glad to be here.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Raymer, we've got a lot to discuss, and it's going to be a very informative hour because every time I talk to you, I find out more about the subject, and it's really scary. And I know that's a word I used earlier, but people are genuinely scared when they get that letter from a government body about eminent domain. But before we get deep into that, why don't you take a few minutes and tell our listeners about your background and the Maguire Lassman Law Firm.
Maguire Lassman limits its practice to eminent domain. Mm-hmm. And between Harold Lassman and myself, we have over 60 years of processing eminent domain parcels, going to trial, probably negotiating 99% of them so that it doesn't require trial. Probably about 10% of the many parcels that we have closed have gone to mediation. But we pride ourselves in handling the smallest parcels up to parcels that have involved over $10 million. And we believe that we've been charged with having a responsibility to help preserve property rights in our state. And so regardless of the size of it, we're here to help you on those matters.
Now, I know there has to be particular expertise and understanding of the eminent domain law to qualify you and make you just totally focus on that. Why would someone hire an eminent domain specialist like yourself over a regular attorney?
Well, increasingly, lawyers limit their practice to particular areas. I don't do things like divorce law, or criminal law, estates. Other lawyers do that, and they do a very good job at it. I do a good job at eminent domain. Eminent domain, to sort of get into a description of it, involves negotiating. I would consider myself a professional negotiator. Mm-hmm. It gets into trial work when necessary, but it's not frequent. It certainly gets into almost all aspects associated with a real estate closing, because almost in all cases of eminent domain, some kind of property interest, whether it be an easement or a fee simple, sometimes 4 acres if it's for a pond. So I consider myself to be a real estate attorney that has trial and negotiating skills, and that's kind of what you would describe an eminent domain attorney as being.
If someone heard something today and would like to contact you, about a concern with the eminent domain case or a probable issue with it, how can they contact you?
Well, our office phone number is 407-228-9522, and it's a small office, probably about 6 or 7 individuals, two attorneys that are working full-time helping people with these issues, and four and a half people, staff that are helping us with the processing of our claims.
Now, is there generally any charge for an initial consultation?
There is never a charge for initial consultation, and I'd go further to say that on real property claims where they're taking a property interest like an easement or buying actual acreage, we don't charge for that either. We're able to get that paid for by the government as we represent the property owner. There is a claim contingency fee for business damages, but probably less than 5% of our parcels are business damage cases.
Raymer, how would you define eminent domain and condemnation as it relates to the government and property owners?
Well, the word eminent is an old English term that means king, and it is a term that means king's rights over domain, which is a word for land. So it's the king's rights over the land. Well, this country was founded on the king not being able to tell the farmer that the king had decided to put a road through the farmer's land without compensation. So eminent domain is the power, because we need to have the power of the government to take property that is necessary for the good of all of us. But it is the power of the government to take property from its own citizens. But what's important about Florida, and to sometimes lesser extents the rest of the United States, is that Florida requires full compensation to be paid to the property owner when a property interest is taken from them. And that not only includes for the actual land that's being taken, the square footage that's actually transferring title, but it also includes damages to the adjacent land that is being adversely affected by whether it's a road or a pipeline or a water treatment plant.
Okay.
So eminent domain is the power of the government to take property, and in our Constitution it's required that an independent body, i.e. a 12-person jury if necessary, but not usually is it necessary, to be paid for that which they take. And on top of that, the government has to pay the attorney fee and the expert fees associated with that taking that they are initiating. So in the vast bulk of cases, and it would be all of the real property cases, property owners don't pay Maguire Lassman anything.
You're listening to Around the House, sponsored by Romac Lumber, and we're having a great discussion. We're starting a great discussion with Raymer Maguire with the Maguire Lassman Law Firm, and we have Steve Jones here, and he's a pipeline expert, and we're going to talk about eminent domain cases affecting folks right here in Lake County. And I guess the first question is, what are the most common eminent domain and condemnation cases you are seeing now?
Usually it involves the Florida Department of Transportation for a road widening or for a new road like Wekiva Parkway, and oftentimes it includes a substantial retention pond associated with those new roads. But we've over the years handled lots of utility easements, pipeline easements, and that seems to now be a good 30% of our practice is the pipeline easements that are increasingly taking advantage of the ample supply of natural gas coming out of the other parts of the United States, but needing to be distributed down to Florida so that it can help our environment and be used down here.
And really that's more of as coal becomes less popular, a lot of electrical facilities, I understand, are going to natural gas. Isn't that one of the reasons it's such a big push in pipelines now?
Exactly.
Okay. When a property owner faces an eminent domain or condemnation decree from the government, the property owner is allowed to defend themselves. I was unaware of the lot of rights, but please tell our listeners what rights as a homeowner or a property owner do they have to get a just value for their property, Raymer?
I like to sum it up that the first and foremost right is the property owner has the right to know what's going on
Okay.
in a matter that is often rather complicated, i.e., what are the consequences over 20 or 30 years that could result from the pipeline being buried too shallow, from the pipeline causing interference with electrical, with the pipeline interfering with the harvesting of grass off of a piece of property. The reason that when you have a pipeline taking or a roadway widening that you should have an attorney is that the attorney serves as a quarterback of a small team. I really do think of it as a quarterback, and the quarterback is dispensing what the halfback and the other people on the line are doing to protect the property owner. And so you need, because you're looking to the future as to a road that isn't even built or a pipeline that isn't even being installed yet, you need to have a real set of professionals tell you that given the plans that they are reviewing, here's what the property owner can expect. And since the wording in these easements is sometimes very broad, you need to, frankly, pin the entity that wants the easement down as to how exactly they're going to use it. How big's the pipeline going to be? Where is it going to be buried? Where are they going to do their crossings? How is it going to? How much gas is going to be running through it? How often are they going to be there to maintain it? Lots of questions that, with an attorney, with our expertise in drafting and negotiating contracts, we can pin the government down. We can pin the utility company down as to those kinds of flexibility that they're given, and not have them negotiate something that's more flexible than they need. And if they don't want to pin themselves down, we can cause the compensation to go substantially further up than they ever imagined.
But, for example, you're telling me that the property owners have rights, and they have a right to know exactly what's going the project. In other words, they just can't. Government just can't haphazardly, without giving proper information, give them the whole story.
City Hall, when you push back just a little bit through the use of an attorney and experts, is not going to run through you and over you.
You know, Raymer, a lot of people get an eminent domain letter and they think it's a take it or leave it offer. It's very scary. They say, hey, we're going to run an easement, and they feel like either they take it or leave it, and at that point they're left to the mercies of government. Tell us how homeowners should contest it. I guess the first thing's call you, probably, isn't it? Or someone like you.
Yeah, it's someone like me or me. They really need to do something before they ever get the letter.
Okay, what's that?
That is, hire an attorney,
Okay.
either like me, or I have several peers in the state that I would recommend that they use if they didn't want to use me for some reason. But they need to hire an attorney, and I want to take a minute, and I don't want to get too detailed on you, but an attorney is going to help the property owner not shoot themselves in the foot, if you want to know the truth about it.
Okay.
Property owners tend to say things to right-of-way agents that they shouldn't say to right-of-way agents. Property owners tend to think that they are having things documented when they really aren't being documented. I'm trained to always be focused that if it isn't in writing, it doesn't exist.
And the other thing, Raymer, I guess we need to point this out. You've been primarily covering Lake County in this area your whole career, haven't you?
I have.
So you fully know the court system around here.
Yes, and there probably isn't an attorney in Lake County that isn't familiar with me and my reputation for being caring about the needs of the property owners I represent, and very diligent about not leaving money on the table.
The other thing is, for example, I know of a business owner who is involved in the new development of Highway 44127 in Fruitland Park. And because of the way they designed the road, I think there was a little slight easement thing, but his property is now getting flooded. Can an eminent domain attorney help in those circumstances too, Raymer?
Yes, it gets a little bit complicated, but I'm going to give you the simple version of it. There are straight condemnations when the government acknowledges that they're impacting a piece of property with drainage problems, or they're taking actual square footage land, and those are condemnations where the government concedes that the condemnation is occurring. But I think I represent some of the people that have had the problems there at Miller Boulevard and US 441, and so I'm very well aware that in that instance, the government decided to raise the elevation of one driveway by 4 feet and resulted in the property being literally placed in a hole from the perspective of the road. And it caused drainage problems to boot. You would think so with a 4 feet difference in elevation. And that kind of claim that the government didn't recognize until the property owner contacted them and said, "You've done something to me and we need to get it resolved." You have to be wary on those, because the government isn't sending you a letter saying, "Please exercise your rights." They're waiting for you to call them.
And that's the reason we're going to get to this a little later. By hiring an attorney, you're going to ask for all the proper topographies and surveys to make sure that doesn't happen. So that's, I guess what you're saying is that's how you really got to find out what the project is first, and then mesh it to your property and do the surveys, or you could have a problem like that.
Right. And the other thing that I wanted to get across to your listeners is that with inverse condemnation, which we've sort of touched on here, there is a 4-year statute of limitations.
Okay, so you have just 4 years after this occurs.
Yeah, when they start physically affecting you with their flooding and those kinds of problems, if you don't do something about your rights within the 4-year statute of limitation, you're going to be out of luck.
And with the passage of Amendment 8, and I want to touch on just this a little bit, that affects more government quasi doing a private property seizure to raise the taxable burden for our taxable rates for the whole community, correct?
Yes, but do you mind if I explain Amendment 8?
Yeah.
Amendment 8, and I'm very proud of the state of Florida for amending its Constitution and adding Amendment 8 to our Constitution, because Amendment 8 does something that I do in a variety of forms every year and every month, really, is that it protects our property rights as citizens. It says, and it's kind of was spawned out of the Kelo case out of New London, Connecticut, it says that, at least in Florida, the government does not have the right to say to somebody that has a 40-year condo or a beach home on the water that the government has decided that it would be better for it to take that property unwillingly from the property owner and flip it over to a developer that wants to put up a 17-story condominium, because the government wants more tax revenue instead of just the tax revenue they get from a 40-year-old beach house.
So it's really something that's gone well for the people in the state of Florida.
Yeah.
All right, we're going to take a break right now. When we return, we're going to get back with Raymer F. Maguire. We're going to talk more about eminent domain, and just take a break for a minute.
Thank you.
So, same time next week?
Well, of course.
put away a few bucks, feel like $1,000,000. For free tips to help you save, go to Feed the Pig.
Welcome back to Around the House, sponsored by Romac Lumber. I'm your host, Don Magruder, and we've had a super conversation, very informative, with Raymer F. Maguire. He's an eminent domain expert attorney, services Lake and Sumter and Marion counties. And we're about to involve Steve Jones, our pipeline expert. We've got a few more questions for Raymer, but we've got a lot to discuss. Raymer, we've talked about eminent domain. Why don't you take us through the process a few minutes? What's typically what happens in eminent domain process?
So I'm going to use a conceptual 10-year period, knowing that it could sometimes be 5 years and sometimes could be 15 years. But I think of the 10-year period as being the first 6 years being the conceptual idea that a road needs to be widened or a pipeline needs to be put into the ground, and the designing of it. So 6 years, it takes a lot of input from the public, and it takes a long time to get it down to brass tacks as to what exactly the government or the utility company has in mind. Mm-hmm. And then it goes fairly quickly, 2 years to acquire the property interests, the easements, or the road widening land that is driven or necessary by virtue of the design that the 6 years took. And then and only then, when they've acquired all of the property interests that they need, do they spend 2 years constructing the road. So it's a 10-year process, 6 years for design and conception, 2 years for acquisition of the properties needed, and 2 years for construction. And that could be changed, but that just gives you a 20% breakdown.
But I do understand, for example, we're about to start talking about the Sable Trail project. There's some projects that are accelerating because they need to get pipelines up, and I guess the word shovel ready is being used a lot these days. So that actually puts more pressure on property owners to make right decisions. I do need to give a disclaimer again. Today's show is for discussion purposes only, not intended to offer any legal opinion or advice. Always consult your attorney before taking any action. I'd like to package our eminent domain discussion today in the backdrop of what's actually happening in Lake and Sumter and Marion counties. There are going to be a lot of eminent domain actions in regards to the Sable Trail Pipeline project, the new Wekiva Parkway, and the expansion of 466A in Fruitland Park. Understanding there are other cases throughout the area, but these are the large ones, and I think they're going to give you a full breadth of eminent domain as we discuss it. In these particular cases, Raymer, in a nutshell, what type of property rights do these people have in these individual cases?
They have the right to be informed about what it is the government involuntarily is going to be taking from the property owners. That's the summary of it. I could flesh that out almost to nth degree if you want to follow up with a more detailed question that directs me.
Well, we'll leave it there, and as we talk about the various projects, I'm sure we're going to get there. Steve, let's first talk about the proposed Sable Trail project going from, I believe it's Alabama to Orlando, which cuts through Marion, Sumter, Lake, and Orange County. First, what's the project and who's building it?
The project is basically a Spectra Energy project, and it's being underwritten by Florida Power and Light, and the project is just to bring natural gas to these co-generating plants in Central Florida and South Florida.
Now, we're not talking about a small pipe. Do you have some idea of the actual size of the pipe? And
the majority of it's going to be a 36-inch line.
So it's going to be a 3-foot diameter pipe. So it's going to be a pretty good pipe.
Yes,
now,
sir.
is it going to be above ground, below ground, or how will that work?
Well, it's a transmission line, and sometimes transmission lines are confusing. And I like to liken a transmission line to a turnpike, in that you enter a turnpike and you pay a toll, and you have few areas that you can exit off. A transmission line like this is much like that. the product that's in the line will be owned by other entities and sources. The pipeline itself will be owned by the pipeline operator. They'll charge a toll for the product as it moves down the pipe.
So basically, as other gas resources are developed and needed in the state of Florida, various entities can transfer it from Alabama, Georgia, or wherever. Are there going to be different points along the pipeline that can be fed into, or does it all have to start in Alabama?
Well, there is a Hilby connector up there, the loop that will be supplying product into this transmission line, and then there will be laterals that run off of that, and those laterals will be feeding those co-generating plants.
Now, I do want to be clear on one thing. We're not talking about liquid natural gas. You're talking about the dry natural gas, correct?
Yes, yeah. It basically is refined and processed before it gets to the pipeline itself. Any kind of liquids or any kind of condensates, paraffins, those are all removed in a process called cracking and refining. And those become butane, propane, and ethane, and they will not be in this line at all. The gas that will be in the line will be completely dry. They'll remove particles from it from filtering, so it'll be a clean, enclosed system.
So it's not going to be a case in which you could have a spill.
No.
Okay. Now, to put a 36-inch pipe from Alabama to Orlando, that's going to be a big deal. You're going to have to cut across a lot of property, swamps, and all this. How big a swath, how big an area are you looking first to construct the pipeline, and then after the pipeline's constructed, what type of easement area are you looking at?
You usually have two separate segments. One is the permanent easement area, and they'll be looking for a 50-foot area to permanently install the pipe, and that would be in that location until abandonment. And then they'll be looking for a 50-foot additional temporary workspace area next to that to be able to do their construction. As they go through wetlands, they'll skinny down to a 25-foot workspace. And after construction, those temporary workspaces go away and the 50-foot stays in place.
But the big issue with the pipeline, correct me if I'm wrong, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, it's not going to be so much of a hazard to the environment, what I'm hearing. It's just going to be a pipeline going through someone's property, and also you have the deal that there's a natural gas pipeline going through. Am I wrong or right? Or am I missing something?
Well, I can say that natural gas is the best of the best as far as hydrocarbon supplies, and they're much better than coal or diesel fuel or number two oil that they're currently burning now. So to be able to get these co-generating plants off to natural gas is quite an advantage for us.
And once again, I think you're leading up to the next question. This is something we have to do. It's almost we've sort of locked ourselves into a natural gas solution. Is that true?
Well, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, they're the governmental entity that oversees interstate natural gas, and their function is to be able to make sure that the grid system is functioning and has a supply to be able to support that.
Now, Raymer, I'd like to sort of bring this mesh to the conversation. We've sort of heard about the pipeline, and Steve, y'all can chime in, but we're talking about a 3-foot wide pipe going through a piece of property. Then they're going to need, I think, 50 foot and then 25 foot. So just for discussion purposes, 100 foot at one time, maybe to install the pipe. How do you get a compensation value for eminent domain on something like that? Because, I could imagine you could have a piece of farmland, if it cuts right across the center of it, it could render things in a bad way. How do you make these evaluations, Raymer?
First thing that happens is that the government appraises from their point of view how much is due to the property owner for the taking. In your case, you were talking about going across a pretty large swath of land, and in that case, the in your example, and that happens to be one that Steve Jones and myself have worked on, and we've had a discussion with Mr. Marshall Parton, and he has given us permission to use his taking as an example. But Sable Trail initially proposed to put the pipeline through Marshall Parton's substantial acreage.
Okay.
And it was going to interfere.
Can I ask you something? Where's the property located at?
It's in South Lake County.
South Lake County. So someone local. Okay.
Right. And so Steve, speak to this as equally or well or even better than myself, he analyzed what was Marshall Parton's desires, and he, as you sort of intuitively understood there, before I even discussed with you Mr. Parton's property, understood that it wasn't so good for a pipeline to be going through both wetlands and going through uplands and literally through a major swath of land that Mr. Parton owned, and that it was better and much more desired by Mr. Parton that it go along the perimeter of his property.
Okay.
And that way you kind of know where the pipeline is, and after 10 years you don't forget that it's where you're about to dig. You know that it's along the road and they're along the perimeter. And so Steve, under help with Maguire Lassman, took it upon himself to talk to Sable Trail and say, do this alternative. And if you don't mind turning to Steve, I think he can pick it up here and tell you what Sable Trail's feedback was in response to that was.
How did they react to the request?
Basically, what you have to do is put together a good plan that is something that can be constructible. In the pipeline business, there's a term called greenfielding, and that just means that you're running on your own. You're not co-locating with the road. You're not co-locating with a power line. That greenfielding dissects these properties because we live in a section and township and range environment, and most of those properties are north, south, east, west. When you're running a line from the northwest to the southeast, you're going to dissect these properties and have large damage to the remainders. In Mr. Parton's case, they were running directly through a wetland that would be extremely difficult to construct. He also had an environmental easement that had been in place for a good period of time, and it just made sense to move over to his boundary lines and run along the highway or the road there to be able to, it's easier to construct even after construction's complete. It gives them access without coming across his property. So it's a win-win thing. So when you package these together and you bring them to them, they're basically looking at a higher level of when they're putting these lines on a digital map. But you got to get boots on the ground. You got to get out there and take a look at it.
And it sounds to me like Sable Trails is willing to work with property owners.
The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission requires that they do that.
Okay. I'm going to ask a dumb question probably now, Raymer. What if someone had a piece of property just adjacent to the boundary of Mr. Parton, and they all of a sudden get wind that there's a 36-inch natural gas line be on the property just next to theirs, and they had a value to that developed piece of property and saying, well, goodness gracious, there's going to be people who are not going to want to now buy the property because of the pipeline. Do they have any eminent domain cause, and should they be consulting you or another attorney about this matter?
They should be consulting an attorney. They should also be consulting Steve Jones under an attorney's supervision. They do not have the same rights that the Mr. Partons of the world do because the property interest is being taken, but they still have the right to go and petition their government, the federal regulatory agency for energy pipelines. They have that right to point out where this pipeline should go so that it doesn't adversely affect them. And Steve Jones can effectively help them figure out if there's a better way than coming right next to their property and affecting it and adversely affecting its value.
Good. You're listening to Around the House, sponsored by Romac Lumber. I'm your host, Don Magruder, and we've been having a great discussion with Raymer F. Maguire, the attorney with Maguire Lassman Law Firm, and Steve Jones, an expert in pipeline construction. And Steve, one thing sort of tidy up our discussion on the pipeline. This pipeline's here now. This is not a long-term project, is it?
Yeah, that's something that's really critical, Don, and that's one of the things that helped Mr. Parton and his property was he acted quickly in getting Raymer and his law firm involved. Time is really of the essence on these projects. They're looking at being in completion and being in a production May of 2017, which is a short 36 months away.
So you're talking about they're going to have to buy the property, build this huge pipeline in less than 3 years, basically.
So now is the time. It moves quickly. You've got to get informed. You need to hire you an attorney and need to have somebody that's giving you information.
And I suspect Sable Trails, the people who own this pipeline, would prefer that the property owner hires an attorney so there's a complete understanding of the process.
Well, to a degree. I have such a background in pipelines that many times the pipeline entity, the energy company, if you're not informed, that might be to their advantage.
So once again, Raymer, it's critical if you get one of these letters about the Sable pipeline, they should give you a call. Now, how are they notifying homeowner or property owners? Do you know, Raymer?
Well, Sable Trail had a rough idea of where they wanted to start up in central Alabama and where they wanted to go south of Orlando. And they have gotten more and more focused as to where the pipeline should go. And using Mr. Parton's property as an example, as they've gotten more and more detail, they've honed it and they've taken advice from property owners and from experts like Steve Jones, and it's getting more and more refined. And the more or less that expression that the train has left the station, well, it's left the station. It hadn't arrived to where it's going to ultimately get, but it's getting there quickly.
We've got to take our final break of that, but when we return, we've got a lot more to talk about with Eminent Domain with Raymer F. Maguire. See you in a minute.
Cigarette butts are the most littered item in America, but they don't have to be. The Keep America Beautiful Cigarette Litter Prevention Program cuts cigarette litter in half. Learn more at preventcigarettelitter.org.
Welcome back to Around the House, sponsored by Romac Lumber. I'm your host, Don Magruder, and we're having a wonderful discussion with Raymer F. Maguire. He's the leading eminent domain attorney in the state of Florida. He's with Maguire Lassman. And we've got Steve Jones, who's a pipeline expert. And we've been discussing the Sable Trail pipeline. And by the way, we want to thank our listeners for listening on WLBE 790 in Leesburg, and also thank our viewers on LSTV, Lake Sumter Television. This is fun to have. This is a great show to have this information on. Hope you're enjoying it. Raymer, we before our last break, we talked about the Sable Trails pipeline. A lot of questions, I'm sure, brewing up there. If someone needed to know where the maps are and information on the pipeline and all the details and how it's going to affect them, there's people saying, "But God, did I not get a notice in the letter? Didn't my little boy throw the letter away?" How can they gather that information?
Well, without committing anybody to hiring Maguire Lassman, they are welcome to call 407-228-9522. And if they just simply want to know, are we going to be probably subjected to a pipeline easement coming through our property based on the latest maps, I will in turn ask expert pipeline Steve Jones, who's here in the studio with us, to answer that question. And we'll bring up their tax ID number, whether it's Marion County or Lake County or Orange County or Osceola County or Sumter County, where most of our clients are located, and we'll figure out whether the latest maps show that they're going to be affected by the pipeline.
Now, I looked at the map earlier, and just for, you tell me if I'm wrong, the way it looks to me, it's going to get a pretty good swath of Marion County, almost diagonally through Sumter County and the last quarter of Lake County. Is that a fair presentation, Steve?
Yeah, that's a pretty good presentation.
Sumter
required
County's
to
really gonna get
have an alternate and a primary.
Yep.
So they'll be looking at two different routes, and that's sometimes what causes the confusion.
Okay. We need to switch subjects because we're running out of time, because the next big project is the $1.7 billion Wekiva Parkway, which is going to link Lake County to Orlando and become part of the huge circle around Orlando. And I guess you got one little property. Say if you got one little property owner out there and you're facing a $1.7 billion project, what do you say to that homeowner who's trying to get just compensation for maybe 2 acres out there, or trying to figure out what's happening to his property? Because I heard the other day they're even talking about elevating the parkway, and while it may be good for nature, an elevated parkway, I'm not a smart man, but it seems like it would basically render your property useless.
The first thing that you ought to figure out is the government proposing to take every square foot of your land, or are they projecting that they only want a part of the land?
Mm-hmm.
The reason that's important is that if they're going to take everything, then it's relatively easy to be focused on value, because you don't have anything left over to kind of worry about how in this case, the Wekiva Parkway, or in the case of Sable Trail, is going to leave you and affect you for years and years. So if it's a whole take, pretty simple. And with a good appraiser, we can get you, in almost every case I've ever seen, more money than the government initially wants to pay you.
Can I follow up just
Sure.
a little bit on that? There's a lot of people who bought land during the mid-2000s, paid a lot more than it's worth today. But we do live in the state of Florida. We do live in an area that is probably one of the greatest places to live, and the property values will increase. They will come back. Say someone bought 10 acres or 20 acres in there, and it was $200,000, but today it's appraised at $100,000. What happens there? Because you could be looking at people having to take huge losses because the market has not fully recovered.
It's a great question. The general rule of thumb, is that you're entitled to the fair market value of the property on the date that title transfers. There is case law that, under certain circumstances, would allow a property owner to say that because the project itself has prevented my property from selling over the last 5 years, it's called condemnation blight, that the date of value can be pushed back to when the condemnation blight or the cloud over your property affected it. So that's the answer. The general rule is on the date that title transfers. But if their project itself has in effect manipulated the date that the property was in effect taken, it can be moved back from the date that they are actually taking it.
But help me out a little bit. The Wekiva Parkway, whether it goes 100 yards one way or 100 yards the other way, could adversely affect the property value. There's some people, the property will be sold at just value and be hurt, and if it's shifted the other way, the property, because it's on the parkway, could be worth a lot of money. How do you sort all that out? Is that another reason why you have to get an attorney like yourself and go through all? First off, there's a lot of surveys you go through, and it's not a cut and dry deal, is it?
It isn't. I have been practicing eminent domain law exclusively since 1988, and I graduated from law school in 1979.
Mm-hmm.
And in that time, I have closed out over 800 parcels that I personally handled. And so I have seen it all. And the process is complicated. It's important for property owners to be fully informed. There are access issues that need to be dealt with. There are drainage issues that need to be dealt with. I'll tell you this, in all those years that I've been doing this, I've never seen a property owner that negotiated their own contract adequately tie down the government as to what was actually going to be put on their property. Never. Since '88, and the reason being is that property owners aren't trained to be as focused on contractual written rights as I am, and as many of my peers are.
What do you see as the biggest hurdles for property owners with the Wekiva Parkway?
Well, I mean, you've got all the standard issues that I've dealt with all these years, and drainage, value, access. What am I going to do with what's left that's next to a 300-foot wide limited access highway?
Yeah.
How am I going to get to it? What's the drainage going to be like? What is the highest and best use of the property? Because it used to be X, and now that there's a wall separating what I had left from, say, Plymouth Sorrento Road, what's my property going to be good for if I can't get to it? So there's a myriad of questions, and I see no reason for property owners not to hire either me or somebody like me, because we do not charge you on these property cases any fee. So why would you not take advantage of free legal services that, because this is an involuntary taking by the government has to pay our fees and pay the fees of our experts in almost all cases.
We haven't discussed that thoroughly, and I think we need to really emphasize that. You're paid by the people who are wanting to take your property.
It's true.
You have the property owners, part of their rights, and that's something they don't understand. They have a right to an attorney without costing them a lot.
It's costing them anything on a property taking.
So once again, if you have to have surveys, environmental surveys, drainage surveys, all those things, if they hire an attorney and they have a letter saying they won't seize your property, that's not at their expense.
Yes and no on that. 99% of the services that I need to protect property owners can be handled by the 30-plus year site engineer that I have and the appraisers that I have. I do occasionally need an environmentalist that can prove up that some groundwater issues are going to be a problem, or to prove up what the septic tank issues are. So there are occasions that there are people that aren't regularly working with me that I need to hire their services, but it's less than 1% of the time.
What if someone has a piece of property, and there's a lot of people now that feel like the government's treading on them. Have a piece of property been in their family, say like the Nevada guy, or he had access to it since 1880, and the government wants to seize it or take part of it, and they want to fight the eminent domain case in court. A lot of people say that's risky. Do you see any redeeming values to go to court, or do you find that there may be cases in which you do go to court?
The government has to pay for their experts and their attorneys when they go to court. The government has to pay for the experts that I hire. They have to pay my attorney's fees. Mm-hmm. So the government needs to be very careful about not putting decent offers on the table when they know that they have the exposure of me and attorneys like me taking them to court. So as a result of those great rights that you have here in the state of Florida, that the government has to pay both sides of the fees, the government can almost always be persuaded to negotiate out a fair amount of money with the understanding that you have an attorney that's saying, if you don't do this, you're causing me to have no choice but to take you to court. So the government can virtually in all instances be persuaded to pay a reasonable fee in light of the threat of a trial.
But I'm hearing, though, if the government offers a reasonable compensation and they do their due diligence at the end of the day, you will probably have to relinquish your property to the government.
It is a foregone conclusion, almost a foregone conclusion, that if the government wants your property, they're going to get it one way or another. What isn't a foregone conclusion is that they're going to get it at the initial, sometimes low price that they want it for.
The last thing about the Wekiva Parkway is that time's squeezing down pretty quick now. The construction started. So if you're a property owner and you haven't made any decisions, you need to be contacting someone pretty quick, don't you?
That train has definitely left. I would say, though, that this is a project that it's been around for 20 years.
Yep.
It's been really cracking quickly over the last 3 years. But there is some parts that are closer to I-4 that probably won't even start construction for 3 years. But they're moving away. They're moving up from 441, where the Wekiva Parkway currently starts, and they're going to start bending both to the northwest as well as to the northeast toward I-4, and it's coming.
We would like to thank Raymer F. Maguire and Steve Jones for being with us. We've had a great discussion on eminent domain, and hope you learned a lot. We'd like to thank the folks at Lake Sumter Television and WELB Around the House. And please join us next Monday for Around the House, and join us every Wednesday in the South Lake Press and every Friday in the Daily Commercial. Until next week, we'll see you around the house.